When we talk about overhead variances, I think they're a lot harder to understand or comprehend than the material and the labor variances. And, perhaps that's because we can easily conceptualize labor and easily conceptualize material, but overhead is this, non-traceable stuff like rent and depreciation, and we use an allocation method, and so I think it just convolutes kind of what's going on. But when we're doing a flexible budget and trying to analyze why are we varying from our budget, we do want to dig a little bit deeper into the overhead variances as opposed to just taking a total variance and saying, oh, okay, here's what it is. So let me just kind of put this together for you. Let's see if this helps explain it. So when we look at our overhead is made up of two parts. We have variable and we have fixed, and they make up the total overhead. And in this problem, what we've got is a budgeted amount, and that's a static amount, comes from the master budget, and we're going to be consistent. We're going to re-budget what that should be using the flexible budget, which makes sense because you use less overhead items like energy and maintenance items if you don't produce the same amount. So you have to flex that budget, so you're comparing an apple to an apple, and you'll compare that to the actual amount. So if we take some parts of this problem and plug them into our little formula here, we've got the variable overhead costs, the actual variable overhead costs of 1478400. Just format this real quick. And we have our fixed overhead of the actual fixed overhead costs of 1832200 for total actual overhead costs of 3.31 million. Now my original budget said I want to have fixed overhead of 1,800,000. And it doesn't give me a variable overhead amount. We actually have to calculate that. We can do that though because we know that variable overhead is going to be allocated based on plasma cutting hours, as they tell that to us here, and it takes 1.5 hours for every quarter panel that we complete. So we really budgeted, when we did the static budget, for 5,000 quarter panels times 1.5 plasma cutting hours times a $200 variable overhead rate. So we budgeted for $1.5 million. That's the static amount. But remember, that's if we produced 5,000 quarter panels. We actually produced 4,800. So you can't compare an actual amount to a budgeted amount where the quantities are different. So we have to flex the budget, and we say, okay, what should the variable costs have been given that we only produced 4,800? Well, you take 4,800 times the same 1.5 hour of plasma cutting time at the budgeted rate of $200. So our budgeted variable overhead should have been 1.44 million. Now our fixed overhead, and this is harder to understand because you'd think fixed costs are fixed regardless of the level of activity. However, that's not true because we know at some point we can sell machines if we're not at capacity, and we can buy new machines, hire supervisors, fire supervisors, so on and so forth. And so we'll calculate the flexible budget amount for the fixed overhead. And the flexible budget amount for the fixed overhead is not 1.8 million. It's the 5,000 quarter panels times the same 1.5 hours per quarter panel times the $240 of fixed overhead. So when we're taking and calculating the variance, we take the actual amount minus the flexible budget amount. And I noticed I have an error in here. Maybe you didn't catch it. What I did was I took the 5,000 times 1.5 times the 240, and that's fine, but that's a static amount. A flexible amount says 4,800 times the 1.5 times the 240. So there's my new flexible amount. So what you'll notice is fixed costs are, the actual is greater than the budget. That's unfavorable. For the variable cost, the actual is greater than the budget. And So that is also unfavorable. So we have a net unfavorable variance of 142,600. And it's important, the reason we do this variance analysis is to dig in a little bit deeper. Why are these variances happening? Is it because the cost of the energy or the plasma or my maintenance items has gone up? That'd be a spending variance. Or is it because I used the machines longer than I anticipated to make 1/4 panel, so therefore I used more energy and I used more saw blades or plasma gases in this case, and so that caused because those are two different reasons for an increase, both of which need to be managed differently. So now that we have that context in mind, what we're first asked to look at is the variance and the spending and the efficiency variance for the variable overhead. We know our net variance is 38,400 unfavorable. We're going to break that down into, I'll just pull this over here. We have a spending variance and we have an efficiency variance. In the spending variance, this is the formula: actual price minus budgeted price times actual quantity. So the actual price is going to be, we've got to calculate this. We can figure out what the budgeted price was. This is per allocation base, and that was $200 per plasma cutting hour. What was the actual price for the plasma cutting hours that we incurred? Well, we actually incurred this 1.478 million, and that was incurred over 8,400 hours of plasma cutting time. So you divide the two out, you have a $176 actual price of variable overhead. And remember, that's the stuff that varies with production, the oils that it takes to run the machine, and the plasma gases to run the machine, and the saw blades and those sorts of things. And we multiply that, the difference between those two, times the actual quantity. Now the quantity here is not the quantity of units produced. It is the quantity of hours actually consumed on that particular machining center. So the difference here, so 176 minus 200, let me just do this. My spending variance equals the 176 minus the 200 times the 8,400 hours that I actually spent on the plasma cutting machine. So if I do that math, 170, I got an order of operations are very important here. 176 minus 200 times 8,400. So I have a negative, this is saying negative, $201,600 variance. Now we need to determine, is that favorable or unfavorable? Because this is where we're going to go to our purchasing department and say, hey, what's going on? You either overspent or you underspent on our variable overhead items. So we actually spent 176, which is lower than the budgeted spend. So that's a good thing. That's a favorable variance. So that's the spending variance. The efficiency variance happens for different reasons. Instead of the amount we spent, it's the amount we used. If you turn on a machine and let it run all day, you're going to use electricity. And that's an efficiency variance. You're either running the machine slower and using up more energy, running it faster and using less energy. And the formula is to take the actual quantity, and that actual quantity, remember, is of the allocation base, the item that we're allocating the overhead over, which is 8,400 hours. And you then subtract that from the budgeted quantity. Now the budgeted quantity is a little bit harder to see and understand. The budgeted quantity says, okay, well, if we made 4,800 panels, yeah, we budgeted an hour and a half per panel. So it's the quantity produced times the allowed amount per item. So it's 7,200 hours. So we were allowed 7,200 hours. Okay, so then you take that and you multiply it by the budgeted price. And the budgeted price is the $200 an hour. Alright, so the efficiency variance equals, let me just do it this way. The efficiency variance equals my actual quantity of 8,400 hours minus the 7,200 hours. Order of operations is important here. And you multiply that by the 200 bucks an hour. So it's 1,200 times 200. This is a dollar amount. Again, we have to indicate, is that favorable or unfavorable? Well, we actually used $8,400. Or 8,400 hours. We only should have used 7,200 hours. It took us way longer to make the product than we anticipated. So that's not good. That's unfavorable. And you'd ask for reasons for that. Someone in the production department could come up with several reasons why it took longer. The skill level of the employee working on the machine was much lower than we thought, so it took them longer. They used more energy. The machine wasn't running well. The maintenance hadn't been done appropriately, so it took longer. So there's lots of reasons for that. Now remember, and this is what I think is important, we have a net variance between the spending and the efficiency variance now of, if you add the two together, 38,400. And lo and behold, that matches the amount on the flexible budget. When you compare the actual to the flexible budgeted amount, it's an unfavorable amount. But now we have much more detail as to how we would manage that difference and start asking questions so that we can improve going forward. So that's the answer, very long answer to the very first requirement.